Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for coming to this session. I do know that Blue Origin is speaking at the same time, so I very much appreciate that you chose us. Today we'll be talking about enabling sustainable human life using artificial intelligence. I am Natalie Rens. I'm the founder of Astria, which is an AI venture dedicated to sustainable life in space. This is my brain, side profile. My PhD was actually in neuroscience, and I had a background in biomedical science. I was using machine learning to try to predict human voluntary decisions, and that's really what got me excited in artificial intelligence, so I continued on into strategy. Then it was February last year when Starman was launched into space by SpaceX that I suddenly had a life epiphany and realized that I really wanted to be dedicating my skills to working on human survival in space. And so what we'll be talking about today is really centered on the plans that we have as a venture for how we want to achieve this. And I'll be joined by the lovely Koorosh from AWS.
Thanks, Nat. My name is Koorosh. I'm not a neuroscientist. I'm not a scientist at all. I'm a solutions architect at AWS based out of the beautiful Sydney, Australia. My focus is machine learning in the solution architecture team. And I find myself doing a bit of marriage counseling these days between the data science teams and the engineering teams, making sure that they work closely together and they both deliver value for lines of businesses. Today, later in this section, I'm going to talk about the technology considerations of deploying AI infrastructure in space. So I'll talk to you in a bit.
So we're breaking it up into three main sections today. I'll be providing a little bit of context about the challenges that we face for life in space, and in particular on Mars. I'll then be talking about our plans that we have to build autonomous habitats there. And then Koorosh will be coming back up to talk more in depth about the technological considerations we have to make to deploy this on Mars. And then we'll wrap up. So let's be optimistic, which I am. And let's say that it's about 10 years from now, or 2030, and we have the very first human mission to Mars. We go knowing that there are challenges for life on Mars. We go accepting of the inevitable risks that we will have to take. But we also go in the spirit of human exploration, which has driven us as a species to where we are today. When we arrive, we are going to be the first humans to ever set foot on the red planet. And if we succeed, this will mean that we are not only the very first interplanetary generation, but we will be paving the way to go even further one day to actually establish life beyond in the stars. So we have a pretty epic mission. We face about 5 months of travel to get there, and once we arrive, it'll be about 2 years before we can return back home. So what are we going to experience? The first thing we'll discover is that gravity on Mars is about a third of what we have here on Earth. We actually don't really understand what this is going to do to our bodies because we've only ever experienced what it's like to be on Earth or what it's like to have basically zero gravity on the International Space Station. But we do know that this is going to have a toll physiologically. I'm particularly concerned about the fact that it squishes your brain a little bit into your skull. But hopefully that there's enough gravity with this 1/3 that we can actually live there long term and adjust to this. We're not going to have any oxygen. The atmosphere is about 96% carbon dioxide, which means we're going to have to find ways to generate oxygen for us. The atmosphere is also incredibly thin, at about 1% of what we have here, which means that we don't have much protection from the rest of the space. At least we're going to be pretty good in terms of temperature. It's cold, about -284, but primarily in the poles, and it gets as warm as 86 degrees Fahrenheit. Around the equator and during the day. No space talk is complete without talking about radiation. So this is also something we're going to have to contend with. The map that we're looking at here is the cosmic rays that we're exposed to from outer space, which are the ones that are really hard to protect from. And we can see that the best case scenario that we face in this light blue region is around 13 rems per year of radiation dosage. In comparison, what any of us are exposed to on a normal year is about 0.6. So it's a little bad. However, in my research, I was really excited to come across this space on Earth, Ramsar, Iran, I'm not sure if I said that properly because he's Iranian, where the radiation that they're exposed to on a continuous the radiation that they're exposed to from basically the uranium that's bubbling up through the hot springs is 13 rems per year. And what they've discovered is that they don't have a higher rate of cancer there. In fact, there's a lot of evidence that they have a radioadaptive effect to the radiation. And we're starting to see maybe similar findings with Scott Kelly's year in space as well. So there's potential that we just adapt to the Martian environment. We're also pretty lucky in terms of planets that Mars is very, very similar to Earth in its alignment. It's only 40 minutes longer for a day, which means that our circadian cycles are relatively conserved, and we will experience some form of seasonality there. We have these very beautiful dust storms that are kicked up and can actually cover the entire planet at a point in time. And this red coloring that you're seeing is from the iron in the regolith or the Martian dust. And these same dust storms and the same iron makes the sunsets blue, which I think will be a pretty amazing sight to see. So we have a challenging, but not necessarily an impossible environment to contend with. The other thing that we're going to have to do is we're going to have to create resources for us to live on. And this is primarily going to come from in-situ resource utilization, or the ability to make it from what is actually available on Mars. We need to do this because we can't actually afford to carry much weight with us when we go there. However, again, we're pretty fortunate that from just the land, we were able to make most things or everything that we will need. From this Martian regolith, we can use this very rich iron and carbon, and we can make steel. The silicon from the sand, we can heat, pressurize, and we can make glass. So we already have the starting components for what could become habitat structures. And finally, with a carbon-rich environment, we also have the capacity to make plastics. So we really have these building blocks that we need to generate the materials that we use here on Earth, up on Mars. Energy is obviously critically important. The first thing that we'll be deploying is solar, but as we've seen, we have these massive dust storms that take over the planet. It's actually responsible for killing our last rover, Opportunity, who was unable to power up again after a very long storm. So if we're looking at a long-term situation there, we're going to have to rely on nuclear, most likely. And these are these little baby kilopower nuclear reactors that NASA's developing. Lastly, of course, we need water. We are 70% water ourselves. And this beautiful kind of cinnamon bun that we're looking at is the North Pole of Mars. And this is water ice. We have the same on the South Pole. And what's even cooler is that last year, it seems like we might have actually found pure liquid water underground in aquifers, which we still need to examine, but could mean that we have multiple methods for extracting water and bringing it back to the settlement. So we have a challenging but doable environment. We have everything that we need to create resources to live on. There's one final factor which is going to be incredibly challenging for us, and that is simply the pure isolation of being on Mars. So for the entire time that we're there, while we're looking back at Earth, this is going to be our view. And who can see Earth? Put your hand up. Oh, very good. For those of you who can't spot it yet, there we go. That is every single person that you know, the entire rest of humanity on that tiny little pale blue dot. And as we're all aware from watching Martian, it didn't bode too well for Matt Damon. It's going to be a little bit difficult for us as well. We are very, very social creatures. We spend our entire existence with the networks around us, with the people that we love, our friends and family. We prioritize being able to go to family share day with our kids. And suddenly we're going to find ourselves in a planet where we're potentially with only 4 other people when we first arrive. And everyone else we know is over 100 million miles away. For me, this means that we have to really consider not only the functional aspects of living there, but we have to make sure that anything we design for Mars also does its utmost to ensure comfort, well-being, and some level of safety that the future is not going to completely jeopardize our survival. There's also a very logistical concern about being so far away, and that is the ability to communicate with Earth. So if we look at this little blob that's moving from the right side, That is a radio signal moving at the speed of light from us on Mars back to Earth. And this is at the absolute best theoretical situation where the planets are perfectly closely aligned. As you can see, even though it's at the speed of light, it seems ridiculously slow. So most of the time, we're actually facing a communication lag of between 4 to 24 minutes, and this depends on where in the orbit we are. Obviously, when we're close together, that's short, and when we're at opposite sides, that's 24 minutes. And that's one way. So if we were to be on Mars, and we were to have something go wrong right now, suddenly a fault that we didn't know what was happening, and we wanted to actually radio back, right now, with the orbits that we're currently in, it would take 20 minutes for that to travel back to Earth, to mission control. There would be no possibility to have a conversation because they would add another 40 minutes to this. And even if they managed to figure this out for us immediately and send back, it would be about 50 minutes before we had any support from anyone other than who was with us there on Mars. This is in very stark contrast to what we face today, where we typically have around 3 times 50 people working around the clock at mission control to make sure that everything operates smoothly, that there is real-time support, and that no matter what happens, you have access to not only those in mission control, but any other experts around Earth to help. So moving forward, it's not even a question of whether we need to introduce automation or something more intelligent, artificial intelligence. It actually becomes entirely infeasible to think about operating the way that we do today. So in order to have a sustainable future in space, we will require artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence can be used, and I think will be used in many aspects of space exploration going forward, from the robotic explorations to the technologies that we develop for humans. But for me, when I started to think about how is it that we maintain human survival, I rested on the one thing that protects us most of the time, about 80% of the day, in fact. And that is the buildings that are around us. That is the homes that we come back to every day, the places that provide us safety, where we choose to raise families. And that's going to be the same thing for us on Mars. That'll be the habitats. Except in this case, it's not only providing these normal realms of safety, but it's also essentially creating this little Earth ecosphere, again on Mars, so that we can survive. We can have all these things that we need, like oxygen. The first thing that we're going to have to do is to create the physical structure. And I won't spend too much time on this, but these are the 3 approaches that we're really focusing on as a community, and detailed by Björk Ingels' group, which is by far one of my favorite architects. And they basically say that our first option is to excavate, or to live in caves. This is really, really good for radiation protection. It provides some thermal protection, but as we know, we don't really like living in the absence of sunlight. It can have its own psychological issues, and it also makes it really difficult for us when we're trying to choose a spot which has access to resources like water, that we have to live in these confined areas. The second option, which is very popular, is 3D printing. It gives us the capacity to create these functional spaces. It's very flexible, but it's not that great at actually creating a bubble that we can live in. For that, we turn to this last one of inflatable domes, which are always these very beautiful, idyllic scenarios that we imagine. These are very good at basically ensuring that the atmosphere, the gases that we need, et cetera, are all well maintained, but they are terrible at radiation protection today. The good thing is we don't actually have to choose. We can combine all of these, and we can create a hybrid structure, which is what Big has proposed, that basically covers all of these different scenarios. So we've taken inspiration from this. We've created these habitats that combine the physical structures that we need. But the other thing that we need to ensure is that this very, very fragile biosphere that we need as human beings is maintained. And this needs to be maintained regardless of what happens, with our changing human activities, with a change in the resources that we're actually able to extract and bring back. We also have to consider that we are not simply building for a group of 5 people to sit inside a little bubble for 2 years and then come back home. What we're trying to build here is a system that will be modular, that will be able to adapt and scale, as we continue to build a human settlement and maybe even a civilization one day. It's not going to be possible for us to do this manually. If anyone's heard of biosphere, we know that we haven't done that great at it so far. But what we can do is we can actually turn the habitat itself into an intelligent agent, something which is capable of sensing the environment and then acting in a way that achieves the goal of basically ensuring that we live an optimal human life there. I feel the need right now to point out that we are not building hell. I have been accused of this, and I'm not as evil as I look, I promise. Hey, you laughed. So how are we actually going to do this? The first thing we need to do is we need to take this physical space and we need to bring it into the world where algorithms can live, in the information world. So we need to kit out this entire physical structure and sensors and essentially create a digital twin, a replica of this environment. From this point on, anything that occurs in this physical habitat will also have a real-time twin operating in the information space, exchanging data with it. The good thing about this space is it actually doesn't have to exist in a time frame of just the physical space, but we can actually perform simulations, thousands of them at once or even into the future. So we said we really need to have a lot of sensors to make this as vertical as the physical habitat as possible. The first thing we need to monitor is the environment, the temperature, oxygen levels, the other aspects that we need to have well-being as humans, such as lighting conditions. We will have to monitor humans themselves, the activity that we have. We could incorporate data from things such as wearables about our health. We'll need to monitor sleep because this is something which we know is always severely disrupted when we go into space or any other isolation settings. And finally, we could even look into monitoring things such as social interactions, because this actually gives us a very good measure of things such as depression and anxiety. And in many remote studies or remote cases on Earth, it's actually been the cause of a mission fail. I will quickly point out that as we move forward as a community, we will need to consider where is this line that we cross in terms of wanting to ensure that we remain healthy and well in space, and also wanting to continue to protect our privacy. We'll have to monitor things such as the climate, radiation, to try to predict when flares are coming towards us. And then what will be critically important for sustainability is obviously that we have a very, very good model of what's happening with our resources. The water, the energy that we have coming into the habitats and that we're able to produce, and our own rate of usage. Once we're able to sense this environment, the second aspect will be how do we actually control it or act in it. The first option we have is through environmental control, which is something that many of us are already getting used to today. I'm sure we have building automation. Many of us probably have something like a Nest in our home. And so as we go into the future, we'll be getting much smarter with the way that we're able to do this, becoming proactive rather than simply reacting to defined settings. The other option, which I'm particularly excited about, is the ability to not only change the environment, but to physically adapt structures to allow them to help us live sustainably, to cordon off areas so that we don't have to power the rest of them, or to even wrap up around humans to provide extra levels of comfort when we need it. The system will have to have an interface directly for us humans to interact with it. And at all times, what's going to be super important is that this also is very transparent to mission control, that as soon as we can, we send data there, and especially in the terms of critical events, that this is essentially automatically routed, so we gain as much time as possible for them to be able to help us. So we essentially have the ability to sense the state of the environment. We have the ability to act in the environment. If we want to make something intelligent, we're obviously missing something. And that's the ability to learn how it is that we should act there. And if we add this little reward function in here, I'm sure many of you will recognize we get to a point of reinforcement learning, or what is normally today deep reinforcement learning using neural networks. And this type of approach essentially says that we're going to treat an algorithm in a similar way that we would treat a child learning. We're going to allow it to perform trial and error. And like a child, if it does something well, you give it a sticker. You hope that your child does it again. If it does something bad, if she gets into an argument with her brother, you tell her off, and theoretically they don't do it again. We can do the same thing with an algorithm. What we've done when we've applied this to buildings on Earth is normally we've given it two scenarios. The first is that we reward it for having resource surplus. So if we're trying to conserve energy, we want our batteries to still be relatively full at the end of the day, and we also want our humans to be comfortable. We can do the opposite, and this is actually more common. We punish it every time we run out of energy, and we punish it every time a human dies in a simulation environment or is uncomfortable. However, reinforcement learning has particular issues. It's been incredibly good at achieving success in, for example, beating our world champion at Go with AlphaGo, or even more recently starting to beat humans at basically strategy video games like StarCraft with AlphaStar. But these are still contexts where no matter how complex, there is still a finite environment, a finite number of possibilities that the algorithm needs to learn. As soon as we try to apply this in the real world, we face this massive uncertainty, which is irreducible. No matter what we do, we're always going to have uncertainty. And particularly in this aspect, what we have is this very dynamic biosphere, which we're trying to maintain stability in. So if we're going to do this, we can't actually map every single factor that happens in the environment, but we still have to be able to respond in a way that we're not basically bulldozed by uncertainty. So the first thing that we need to have is an algorithm that can maintain an internal state, that is aware of what it needs in this internal model to function. It also has to have awareness of the environment, what it needs for that internal state, and where there is uncertainty in the environment, so that it can act accordingly, making sure that no matter what happens with these environmental interactions, this internal stability is always maintained, that we achieve equilibrium. Fortunately, we can learn from what is essentially the best species to exist at doing this. Us as humans and many other organisms are phenomenal at doing homeostasis, or maintaining this equilibrium in our own bodies. And us particular have managed to achieve this despite the fact that we actually came out of the Sahara, that we've traveled, adapted to various environments, ended up in Las Vegas, and we're still able to maintain a homeostasis and make sure that we function in the way that we need to. And the way that we think we can do this is by basically having this phenomenal ability to predict the future, or to simulate the options for the future that exist and go with the most likely choice that's there. If you think about the needs that we often have to meet, we don't wait until we're basically dead on the floor, dying of hunger, before we go responding, looking for food. We actually have very complex plans that we put in place for what we will do to acquire food before we even are hungry. Many of us in the room might even already have dinner plans, knowing that in future you will be hungry and you will have to meet that. From a neuroscience perspective, our theory of how we're able to do this is called active inference, and this is proposed by Carl Friston. This essentially says that we're basically just little physics beings, which is kind of elegant and also kind of degrading. We lose this entire notion that we have these special needs, such as seeking comfort or seeking warmth, and we basically boil it down to, we are a little physics being, and our goal is to minimize entropy, or to minimize this chaos and uncertainty in our own state. We can formalize this in a reinforcement learning term very simply as saying that we need to first be able to seek information about the world. I need to know this internal model, but I also need to know the external world around me. And second, that we need to have this reward function. But this is not reward in the typical sense, such as a point in reinforcement learning. The reward here is actually us arriving in the state that we expected to find ourselves in. And the state that we are constantly expecting to find ourselves in is this baseline that we need to always maintain. So if you all close your eyes right now and you try to picture the world around you, I'm sure many of you are actually able to imagine you're sitting on a seat. You have some kind of idea where in this basically auditorium you're seated, the location, And you might even be able to think broader into ARIA and have the formings of a mental map of how to get to other places around you. You can do this all despite the fact that right now you have no visual data coming in, because you very accurately used information and built this map of the external world. You can go beyond this, though. If I asked you if you now open your eyes, what you experience, you also know that now or in 5 minutes' time, you're likely to still be seated on this chair, and in this very stable environment, you're likely still to be seeing me talking about AI in space. If anybody closed their eyes and was unable to picture this world that you're seated in, you probably partied a little bit too hard in Vegas last night. So we can do the same thing for the habitat. The habitat is going to have incoming signals that it needs to respond to. Let's say that this signal here represents the water that is coming into the habitat, a very critical supply for us. We don't actually now have a specific water metric. The only thing that the algorithm in this habitat is driven to do is to, as accurately as possible, model this external world and make sure they can do that, predicting it as much in advance as possible. If we can predict things in advance, that gives us the capacity to act in advance rather than being reactive. And if we can do that, we get to this point of maintaining our baseline or equilibrium. This gives us two really cool factors. The first is it gives us the capacity for dynamic learning. It incorporates this idea of curiosity, which is not like the little rover, but he's really cute. This will essentially tell us that if we have different levels of uncertainty in the variables that are around us, or for visual purposes, these different rooms, that we are innately driven to seek out the one where we are less sure about what is happening. By doing this, we not only very rapidly build a model of the habitat environment, but we can continue to adapt and learn as time goes on. The second factor that this gives us is the ability to have dynamic response. We can learn the normal fluctuations in something. We can treat this signal here as, for example, carbon dioxide levels. But as soon as we see something which throws a prediction error that suddenly is completely contrary to what we have predicted, for example, if we look at this trend here, this very steep rise, we could respond to that immediately to flag that as being something we've never seen before. We don't actually have to wait for it to cross the threshold where it's in a range that we don't want to be as human beings. And this is actually how things function, to my awareness, on the International Space Station today, is we manually wait for these thresholds and then change systems. We won't have to do that. So taking this all together, what we're proposing is a system which is able to autonomously manage the habitats on Mars. We'll be doing this by taking a very heavy sensory system and uploading this into a digital twin, which we can then use to run simulations, training an algorithm that constantly acts to maintain equilibrium, and thereby helping us achieve sustainable life. We'll be working hard at this, but we're also aware that to make this happen, we're going to need other factors. We have every intention of turning this into reality and not just sci-fi, and we're starting to think about this now. So I'd like to have Koorosh come up, take over, and he's going to be talking to you about the technological considerations that we have to make sure that we can actually deploy this on Mars.
Thanks, Natalie. So we know that AI is going to take the center stage in our space colonization efforts. And since Alan Turing, almost 70 years ago, came up with this idea of the child machine, we've come a long way to make the AI dream come to life. But we know we're just at the beginning of this journey. In this part of the talk, Natalie talked about building an intelligent habitat. But how are we going to deploy technology infrastructure, in particular a massive amount of compute capacity to run these AI models, active inference or reinforcement learning, and the rest of it? And let's start with our beautiful home planet of Earth. The way we are building an AI system, an AI pipeline right now, is that we have some fundamental pillars. We ingest data, different types of data, and then we transform them, and we catalog them, we index them, and when the data is sitting in an AI-usable format, we feed it into machine learning models, and then we create a model. We often need to tune that model also called hyperparameter optimization. And then if we are happy with the performance of the model, then we push it into production. We make inference calls against it. The most important critical step here after pushing into production is to constantly monitor the health of the model to make sure it is not degrading or our models are not drifting. And then we have a lot more data and the results of our monitoring, and we push that back into the beginning of the pipeline. And we repeat this process over and over again. So it's all fun and games, and we've been doing that. In fact, the AI system that we are using on a daily basis, such as Amazon Alexa, are using some form of pipeline in their backend, pretty much like this. But we need a ton of compute. We need a lot of fast storage. We need super fast networking, giant software stacks, and obviously a lot of electricity. We don't have that luxury in space right now. In fact, the most sophisticated piece of technology that we have on Mars is Mars Curiosity rover, with 2 CPUs, standby and active CPUs of 200 megahertz of clock speed, 256 megabytes of memory, and 2 gig of flash storage, and at best of times, direct communication back to Earth is 32 kilobits per second. We're not building for another rover run, right? We are building for an entire new human settlement. The intelligent habitat that Natalie described needs massive amounts of compute, and we have some serious obstacles to overcome. The top 3 that stand out for us in terms of technological considerations is, first, the compute capacity that we will need to deploy on Mars to run these systems. Second, the AI architecture that we're going to use to make sure that this compute capacity is being utilized to the nth degree. And third, communications, networking, back and forth to Mars. Let's look at these areas one by one. So we have a lot of challenges of taking hardware with us to Mars. The 2 most important ones are, first, radiation. Natalie described that radiation is going to be harmful for human. It is also super harmful for electronics. A galactic cosmic ray or a solar flare can completely destroy or degrade transistors or message buses inside electronics. That's why currently, if you want to send a piece of electronics into space, it needs to pass through more than 200 different tests to get into a mission. An equally important problem is also weight of the equipment, the mass that we are putting on the payload on top of a rocket. A typical server weighs kilos or tens of kilos, and the mass of the payload, it directly correlates with the cost of the mission. Even with the best rocket propellants that we have now, the best chemistry we can get, which is basically liquid hydrogen and oxygen, there needs to be 83% of the entire rocket mass as fuel. And this will leave us with 17% of everything else, which is the rocket itself and the payload. So when it comes to putting stuff into this payload section of the rocket, every single gram counts and can add to the cost of the mission. So with knowing all of that, let's look at a few options that we have into deploying compute infrastructure into space to support Natalie's intelligent habitat. The way we're doing it right now, specialized hardware, surprise. And these hardware are usually very expensive, first of all, and are very low performance, but heavily customizable to the mission, and they can tolerate the presence of radiation for a long period of time. On the right, you'll see RAD 7050. This is one of the most loved CPUs in space right now. It has been tested on board many spacecraft, including Mars Curiosity rover. It has 200 megahertz of clock speed, which is not a lot, and it only costs you $200,000. So 2 small limitations. So if you want to continue down this path of creating a specialized hardware, radiation-proof hardware, we have to figure out a way to bring their speed up and bring their cost down. But we might end up using commodity hardware in space. It is an easy option. It is cheap. It is easily replaceable. And because it's cheap, we can take many of them with us. Obviously, it's going to add to the weight problem and whatnot. But if you figure out a way to protect these hardware from radiation during the trip and inside the habitat on Mars, and bring their weight down, we could be looking at actually a really, really good option of running huge compute capacity on Mars. Speaking of weight and radiation during the trip, one of the ways to bring the weight down and also to protect the equipment from radiation during the trip, which is a lot higher than actually when you're in Mars because of the atmosphere we have there, is to utilize the destination resources. The space community is working so hard on getting in-situ resource utilization going, and Natalie told you that we can produce steel, we can produce glass, we can produce plastics in there. The interesting fact is that 43% of the Mars soil is actually silicon dioxide. So it is not hard to imagine that one day we will be sending precision 3D printers to print silicon chipsets for us. So that is another way. Pardon me. But this intelligent habitat needs a lot of compute. We think it is not possible at the end of the day to send tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands cores of CPUs or GPUs with us, right? But these systems will be the difference between living and not living in this planet. So how can we take this further? The good news is that there are some promising technologies in our near future that is going to change the direction of compute and change the direction of AI altogether. Most of these technologies are revolving around mimicking how our nervous system and how our brains work. Why brain? On top of our body, we have this amazing, wonderful thing with 100 billion neurons, and each of these neurons can do synapses to 1,000 other neurons in their vicinity. And according to some research, this will give us around 1 exaflop of performance. The main reason for this huge amount of compute is basically because the compute and storage is happening right at the same place, in neurons and in synapses. But that's not all. One of the biggest wonders of the brain is that it does so many wonderful things for us with only 20 watts of energy. If you want to get an exaflop of performance out of a HPC cluster or out of a supercomputer, you basically need to build a power plant right next to that data center. And again, the reason for that is because in this classic hardware architecture that we have right now, von Neumann architecture, we have CPU and different layers of memory and storage, and the data is keep going back and forth between these units. That makes them super power hungry. Where, as I said, in brain, it is happening right in the same place. So I think these are enough reasons for scientists and engineers to always be on the lookout to create new compute hardware and new architecture that mimics our brain and nervous system. This will take me to our next form of compute that we might be hitting the jackpot, neuromorphic computing. In neuromorphic computing, units process and store information as an integrated part of the same operation, just like neurons do via synapses. And the strength of these signals or synapses can grow or fade, just like how our brains basically process that, and it can form memories for us. So this would let neuromorphic computers to undertake tasks, usually intuition requiring tasks, to go at a massive scale of parallelism that we cannot achieve with our classic hardware architecture. However, for pure computations and calculations, classic hardware can definitely beat a neuromorphic chip any day, just like it can beat our brains any day. But everyone is so hopeful about the direction of neuromorphic computing, the future that we're going to have with AI. On the screen, you see Loihi, Intel's research neuromorphic chip that they introduced in 2018. It has 130,000 neurons. We have 100 billion here. So I think we're still a long way away from printing a brain on a chipset. But even at smaller scales, this can take us to a completely new era in artificial intelligence. Obviously, another option that we're going to have in our future is going to be quantum computing. This is not the forum, and this is definitely, we don't have enough time to talk about the quantum mechanic concepts of entanglement or superposition or tunneling to see how quantum computers work. Just a quick primer. In quantum computing, we have this concept of qubits, which is basically our bits, zeros and ones, with a third position, with a third superposition of 0 and 1 at the same time. And this will give quantum computing its massive parallelism power. Everyone is excited about where quantum computing is going to take computing in general, and then AI in future. But I think we're still a long way away from first, creating the right algorithms that can leverage that type of new compute. Second, being able to run these quantum computers in a super noisy environment like space. These quantum computers, because we're working with subatomic particles, they are very susceptible to any form of noise, thermal noise, radiation, vibration, and so on and so forth. And we have them all on Mars. So we have a bit of work to do, but let's not rule this option out. This could be our future. OK, so we will have different options of running massive scale compute infrastructure on Mars. That was the point of the first section of my talk. We will have options in future. But we are designing for an extreme environment. And we have to optimize it to the extreme degrees. Otherwise, our humans on Mars are going to have a bad day. So in order to ensure the best chance of survival for our astronauts, we need to build an autonomous system that provides immediate responses to the living conditions on Mars and is able to learn how to forecast events. So think of this intelligent habitat as a living organism itself, with its sensory skin covering the entire habitat and beyond, sensing the world around it, and then with a distributed brain, making decisions on defining what's going to come next. As Natalie mentioned, we're going to be dealing with a huge amount of IoT telemetry data. And given the potential constraints we're going to have in terms of the compute capacity and in terms of storage and the rest of the technology infrastructure, we have to get a lot smarter in what do we collect, how do we collect it, and how do we feed it through these training or inference engines. One of the ways to optimize this is to actually offload some of these tasks to the edge nodes, rather than ingesting all the raw data into a central processor and do modeling and do inference and whatnot. So we're coming with this concept of creating this sensory skin, which is not only capable of generating data for us, but also capable of doing data transformation or inference on the spot and in real-time basis. Obviously, this is going to give us a lot more faster reaction times, and it's also going to give us some level of resiliency in the architecture of the system in case of disasters. But again, even with edge processing, we're not going to be able to solve this problem of too much data and not enough compute. The reality is that not every data point and not every event that is happening across the habitat is going to be significant for us to detect critical events or forecast critical events. So how do we optimize this even further? Natalie talked about active inference. Active inference and using active inference is basically going to give us something like an attention model. So the attention models, these models provide the first layer of inference to basically detect what is outside the expected optimal zone, and then filter out the noise. And then these lower nodes in the hierarchy, which are doing this kind of inference, are filtering out the noise and then sending the necessary information, the important information about a certain problem space, up back the chain to the central processor. In fact, this is how we humans prioritize our work. Let's do a quick experiment. Can I please ask everyone to close your eyes? OK. Now, who can recall the shirt color of the person sitting in front of you or next to you for the front row? I bet most of you are struggling with this now. Oh, we have one person. Fantastic. 2, 3. I bet most of you are struggling with this because your attention has been focused on processing us rather than processing the rest of what you can see. Correct? Likewise on Mars, let's say we have a problem in a system, let's say in our water management system. The intelligent habitat can intuitively learn to allocate more compute resources to that problem space, ask for more detail, more granular data from that specific problem space, and then filter out the noise. So this is also another way of another way of optimizing our compute capacity. Oops. So to put it all together, we are talking about an intelligent habitat, a strongly distributed brain, which is capable of sensing the world around it and forecasting the events that's gonna happen next. With a level of autonomy and independence from its central processor. This system is continuously evolving and continuously learning and making sure that it adapts to the unseen events and unseen changes that's going to happen in the environment without the need for constant human monitoring. So think about it as an autonomous distributed brain. So I'll keep talking about this autonomous system. I hope I didn't give you the impression that this is an isolated or a disconnected system. This is not. In fact, it is going to be super vital for us that we maintain a healthy and strong communications back to the mission control on Earth and give them on-demand access to the data that we are generating in this habitat. But reliable and fast networking communications from Mars to Earth is challenging because of all the reasons that Natalie mentioned. Planetary movements, distance, latency, radiation, and all the bad things. This means one thing. This means that our existing communication protocols that we're using on Earth is not going to be a very suitable choice for space communications. I'm specifically talking about TCP/IP, talking about IP. IP assumes end-to-end connectivity before it starts transferring packets. And it has been evolved and adapted over the time to work with highly predictable, low latency, high throughput links. That's exactly what we don't have in space. The good news is that some smart people in JPL and other research organizations and commercial organizations are working on this great concept of delay or disruption tolerant networks. It's a new communication protocol being developed, and it is capable of tolerating connectivity loss from seconds to days by sending packets between the sender and the receiver through a network of relays that can store and then forward packets to the next node when it comes online. NASA has a couple of really good animations describing the differences between IP communications and DTN communications. Let's quickly have a look. IP network. So from astronauts, we are sending packets to ground stations through a few relays. See? It needs to have the end-to-end connectivity before it can start sending packets. Sending packets, unfortunately, the red is stuck because communication is cut. So we're talking about big latency and very, very low throughput. What does it mean for DTN? Same scenario. DTN only cares about the next available hop, storing and then forwarding packets. Boom, our first packet in. Second packet, and here we go. So the latency has definitely dropped, and the throughput has definitely increased. DTN will enable us to go from what we have now, point-to-point, high latency, low throughput links that we're using in deep space right now, to something like this, a network of relays that can transfer, store, and forward packets between them to the ground station or to the other nodes in space. Vint Cerf, the father of TCP/IP, the creator of Internet, is now working tirelessly with JPL to make that concept of interplanetary Internet coming to life. So, to conclude everything for my section, in order to ensure that humans can have a good time on Mars, we are building this intelligent habitat that can respond to the immediate conditions on Earth. We talked about different options on different compute options that we're going to have with us on Mars, specialized hardware and commodity hardware, to the emerging technologies that we're going to use in future, such as neuromorphic or quantum computing. And then we talked about how to optimize the architecture of this AI pipeline or AI platform that can utilize that compute capacity to the extreme. We talked about edge processing and edge IoT, and we also touched on using active inference and attention models. And then it's going to be super important for us to maintain a really strong communications back to mission control. That's when we talked about the interplanetary internet concept as well as DTN. So we know that our challenges are plenty. We have some major obstacles to overcome. But we humans have always been explorers, have always been problem solvers. This is not an out-of-reach, sci-fi, crazy idea. We believe these solutions are within our grasps. We just need a final push to make living outside this planet a reality. I'll now hand over to Natalie to wrap up. Nat.
Cool. Thank you, Koorosh. No worries. So I hope in today's talk we've left you excited, ready to tackle the challenges to make life on Mars possible. We've shared some of the vision that we have at Astria to enable this by building autonomous habitats. We're basically joined by a very rapidly growing number of other companies and other organizations around the world who are also working towards a similar goal of allowing us to reach Mars. However, my final remark is not about Mars, but Earth. Our ultimate goal is definitely Mars, but it doesn't mean that we're giving up on Earth. Earth is not plan B. Some of the reasons that I'm so excited about working on Mars is it's an environment which is completely unforgiving, a space where we have to completely test our ability in engineering, creativity, design to enable us to live, and to enable us to live in harmony with Mars. There is no room for being unsustainable there. So if we take this mentality and we take the technology that we develop in pursuit of being able to live on Mars, I believe that we're actually going to develop far better technology for Earth as well to enable us to live more sustainably here. And that is completely central to how we're operating as a company. So how are we going to get from these Martian habitats to something on Earth? Every part of the approach that was outlined today, this part of taking sensory data and being able to produce a digital twin of a human environment, selecting an algorithmic approach which is based on physics principles rather than any context-specific metric, and finally putting human life at the center of how we build. All of these are, in principle, universal. So we're starting here on Earth, in our very own Earth habitats. We're working at the moment on developing technology that will help people live with net zero energy, which is essentially the mecca of sustainability. As we move into the future, we'll be building autonomous systems that can essentially power a building from day one, learning with the inhabitants of a habitat, so that it's optimized not only for us, but also for Earth. As we expand, we expect to reach and to learn from many, many human lives, millions of lives all around Earth, so that one day, when we go to Mars, we won't be starting from scratch. We will be building on 10 years of human history of what it is that we need to live and to thrive. And by doing so, we hope that we can contribute our bit to enabling sustainable human life in space. We're very young as a venture. Astria was established or set up in Los Angeles just 2 months ago. We are definitely looking to build a very strong network in America. We'll be looking for partners, for support, and we'll also be looking to hire very shortly in Los Angeles. If anybody's interested, I would love to chat to you, even just to nerd out. And I hope that you'll join us in working for a sustainable future for humanity. Thank you.